A sudden, chilling knock. On the night of December 25th, 1996, what should have been an ordinary holiday at the Ramsey home in Boulder turned into a nightmare that would grip the nation. By early morning the next day, a 2.5-page ransom note demanding $118,000 had been found on the staircase, and hours later 6-year-old JonBenét's body was discovered in the family's basement. Those facts, a missing child, a bizarre ransom demand, and a body found in the same house, are the hard anchors of a case whose every subsequent development only raised more questions. The ransom note's oddly specific sum, $118,000, became an immediate flashpoint because it matched, almost exactly, the size of a recent bonus reported for JonBenét's father, John Ramsey. That coincidence fed suspicion, rumor, and intense media coverage from the earliest hours, and set a tone in which every small detail will be magnified and debated. If this kind of unresolved mystery draws you in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell to get first-hand updates on this story and others. What followed was an investigation that felt part crime drama, part disaster. The household was no longer a private scene. It became a public spectacle. Police, neighbors, journalists, and others moved through the house in a scramble for answers. The initial 911 call from Patsy Ramsay reported JonBenét missing and referenced a ransom note. Within minutes, officers were at the home. But what might have been routine scene management in a less sensational case was complicated here by the family's prominence, the intense media interest, and the highly unusual ransom note that seemed to point, at least superficially, to someone who knew the family's financial life. Not long after the initial call, John Ramsey discovered JonBenét's body in the basement, and that discovery and the actions that followed would have profound consequences for the investigation. From the moment the house became a focal point of both police work and public speculation, the question that haunted the case was simple and terrible. Who had done this and why? The autopsy would later make the answer to how brutally clear. JonBenet died from a severe skull fracture accompanied by asphyxiation by strangulation. The official medical findings described a serious blunt force injury to the head and evidence that a ligature had been used to strangle her. There were also findings that raised concern about sexual assault. The autopsy recorded injuries consistent with insertion or trauma, though the absence of semen or definitive proof of rape complicated the picture. The convergence of this violence, a catastrophic blow to the skull followed by strangulation, made it hard to argue for an accidental death. Whoever inflicted those injuries either intended to kill her or knew with terrible certainty that the child would not survive. That truth, recorded in the coroner's office and reported widely in the national press, transformed the case from a strange ransom story into a violent homicide investigation with all the urgency and complexity that label implies. From the start, the physical scene offered seemingly contradictory clues that could be read to support very different scenarios. On one hand, the ransom note suggested premeditation and possibly insider knowledge. On the other, certain physical traces, a broken basement window noted by investigators and the presence of unknown DNA on clothing, suggested the possibility of an outside intruder. Then there were the items in the house that complicated timelines and motives. A bowl of partially digested pineapple found in JonBenét's digestive tract, and a large spoon and bowl on the breakfast table with fingerprints later linked to family members. The pineapple detail became especially contentious. Forensic examiners estimated that the pineapple in JonBenét's stomach had been eaten a short time before her death, a window that raised questions about what the family was doing that night and whether official ad hoc accounts matched the physical timeline. Reports in later years noted that fingerprints belonging to Patsy and Burke Ramsey were found on the bowl and utensils associated with the pineapple, and that this nutritional trace and the fingerprint results didn't sit neatly with the family's recollection of where JonBenet had been or who had last tended to her. Those inconsistencies fed both intruder and family involvement theories and ensured the pineapple will be modern shorthand for how small details can become outsized in an unresolved case. Compounding the mystery was a condition in which investigators found the scene and the choices made in those first hours. Law enforcement later acknowledged that the crime scene was not secured in the way homicide scenes typically are today. Several officers, family friends, and neighbors walked through areas of the house. Some evidence was moved or handled, and items that might have been crucial were touched before thorough documentation or modern forensic collection took place. That early handling, whether motivated by a search for a kidnapper or a frantic search for JonBené herself, likely contaminated or muddied biological traces that today's labs might otherwise have separated or analyzed more cleanly. The result was a double tragedy. A child killed in a record of the immediate context that law enforcement and forensic scientists would later say was less than ideal for building airtight legal cases. That reality fed growing public skepticism of the investigation and intensified a media firestorm in which every procedural misstep was dissected and amplified. Among the most talked about physical pieces of the puzzle is the ligature used to strangle JonBené. Investigators discovered a garrote fashioned from a length of nylon cord tied to the handle of a paintbrush. Pieces of that brush were located in the house. The bottom portion of the handle was missing and never fully recovered despite extensive searching. The way the ligature was tied, observers have noted, suggested someone with familiarity for knots and binding, prompting questions about whether that skill pointed to a household member or an intruder with maritime or craft knowledge. The presence of the paintbrush handle, and in particular knot, drew attention because it suggested the killer used an item likely taken from the house rather than bringing a sophisticated weapon. That could be read in different ways, as an opportunistic intruder who used what was handy, or as someone within the home who knew where to find and how to use such an item. The autopsy and investigative reports also noted that part of the paintbrush bristle had been found in a tub of Patsy's art supplies, a detail that reinforced the theory that the implement originated inside the home. These forensic connections fueled theories but did not, on their own, produce a definitive line to a suspect. Another disputed angle centered on a heavy maglite flashlight. Early speculation and later persistent public debate suggested a heavy flashlight might have been used to deliver the crushing blow that fractured JonBenét's skull. The flashlight theory appealed because an object of that size could plausibly cause a kind of localized, forceful trauma scene in the autopsy. It also matched certain scenarios in which a short, heavy instrument rather than a hand-delivered attack could produce the deep skull injury recorded by medical examiners. Yet the flashlight theory was never conclusively proven. Questions remain about whether a flashlight could produce the exact pattern of fracture where such a flashlight would have come from, and why evidence linking a particular flashlight to the head injury was not definitively recovered or preserved. As a result, the flashlight became part of the larger pattern of plausible but unproven physical explanations, forensic possibilities that, singly or together, might explain the injury, but which, through contamination, handling, and the passage of time, never matured into a courtroom-ready answer. Nearly as consequential as the physical artifacts was the DNA evidence that emerged years into the investigation. Early testing eventually identified DNA on JonBenét's underwear that did not match any family member, a so-called foreign male profile. For a long time, laboratory methods weren't capable of fully separating that male profile from JonBenét's own biological material or from other mixed contributors. But the growth of modern forensic tools, including next-generation sequencing and investigative genetic genealogy, gave new hope that the foreign profile could be teased apart and used to find relatives of its source. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey formally announced that DNA evidence excluded the Ramsays as suspects, a development that pushed official focus away from the family. Still, the unidentified male profile remained an open lead. If it could be turned into a usable S&P profile for genealogical searching, it might produce family leads that traditional policing could then investigate. The promise of DNA technology and the caution about over-reliance on it has become central to how this case is understood in recent years. Investigators and outside observers agree that a valid genetic lead would only be the start of a careful process. Genealogy can point you to a family tree, but it cannot by itself convict. Decades of media coverage, competing documentaries, and public speculation hardened the case into a tangle of narratives. One line of reporting and analysis has pushed a family involvement theory, highlighting inconsistencies in accounts, the pineapple timeline, and peculiar behaviors in interviews. Another thread argued forcefully for an intruder. Unexplained DNA, signs of a possible basement break-in long debated in photographs and testimony, and investigators who believed a prowler could have slipped into the house. Over time, the case produced a series of high-profile detours, public accusations, lawsuits, and false confessions, none of which produced a criminal conviction. Some media productions argued for a single dominant theory. Others deconstructed the investigation's flaws and presented new interpretations. That cacophony of competing stories did more than shape public opinion. It complicated investigators' ability to convey what was and wasn't supported by evidence. Each new documentary or book reopened wounds and raised fresh questions about the accuracy of earlier reporting and the durability of existing evidence. What are the takeaways from a case that has resisted resolution for nearly 30 years? First, the physical evidence supports competing interpretations in troubling ways. Certain items and injuries seem to point toward deliberate intent and the presence of a non-family male, while other traces, like the pineapple and family fingerprints, raise questions about the household's last movements and who did and didn't know them. Second, early crime scene mishandling likely erased or muddied leads that modern methods might have otherwise exploited, creating an unfortunate friction between what might have been possible and what remains. Third, the medical findings, a massive head injury followed by asphyxiation, make clear this was not an accident. Someone inflicted lethal violence on a 6-year-old child. Finally, without fresh, uncontaminated evidence or reliable new interpretation of existing DNA traces, resolution is unlikely. That reality leaves investigators with the slow, exacting work of re-examination and the public with the uneasy recognition that time, hands-on handling, and publicity can complicate the path to clarity. As of now, the case remains open in the sense that officials continue to review evidence and that new forensic techniques offer a chance, not a promise, of movement. When DNA review or other lab work does produce a lead, it will need rigorous corroboration, alibis checked, corroborating records examined, and chain of custody issues addressed so that any resulting case could withstand legal scrutiny. For those who remember JonBenét simply as a small girl with a big smile and a pageant crown, these procedural arguments may sound remote. But for justice to be achieved, whether that means the identification and prosecution of a perpetrator or the clearing of the innocent, the scientific and legal details matter. They are the scaffolding on which real-world resolution must be built. This story has spent decades testing patience, memory, and the public appetite for answers. It also tests the capacity of modern forensics to redeem past mistakes when evidence has been handled imperfectly. Whatever the next chapter brings, a new finding, a dead end, or a slow accumulation of corroborated clues, it will unfold against the long shadow of an investigation that began with a Christmas ransom note and ended that same day with the discovery of a little girl who would never come home. The weight of almost 30 years of expectation sits on this moment. The possibility that science, persistence, and careful detective work might finally replace rumor with fact. If you want clear, careful updates as new information becomes available, subscribe and ring the bell. When this story moves, we'll bring you the facts responsibly and fully.